From the Times Center in New York City, City University Television, in association with the New York Times, presents a TimesTalks series with editors and writers of the New York Times. Today's presentation, Disunion, the Civil War.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Olson Day of the New York Times, and I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's TimesTalks. The Opinionator is the place online for exclusive commentary from the Times, including the award-winning Disunion series. Next week will mark 150 years since the Civil War began, and Americans went to war with themselves. The editors of The Opinionator created Disunion to revisit and to reconsider the nation's most perilous period, using a compelling mix of contemporary accounts, diaries, images, and historical assessments to follow the war as it unfolded. We are honored and fortunate to have some of the remarkable voices of the Disunion series with us here tonight, together on our stage. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Jamie Malinowski, and our distinguished guests, David W. Blight, Ken Burns, and Adam Goodhart.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Democrats and Republicans, constitutional unionists, former Whigs, free soilers, know-nothings, abolitionists, secessionists, suffragists, fire eaters, ultras, separatists, cooperationists, submissionists, wide-awakes, bushwhackers, filibusteros, dough faces, and you know who you are. Defenders of the Union and fans of Disunion, thank you very much for coming tonight to talk about the Civil War. I think we all know why we're here. We are all great followers of it. The first observation is that most of us here have lived through all are part of a Cold War, where two great civilizations were faced at one another, had nothing in common, were rivals in every hot spot across the globe, were armed ferociously, and yet somehow managed to avoid coming to war. In the 19th century, our country, our civilization split apart, despite all that we had in common, and managed to come to blows. So how did it happen that we were not able to avoid this calamity? Anybody?
Well, I always like what Shelby Foote said in our film. He said, Americans like to think of themselves as uncompromising people, but our genius is for compromise. And when it failed, we went to war. I think it was the failure of compromise and how the superheated rhetoric that we sometimes hear today can take that extra few steps from fire eating to actual firing.
Yes.
Well, you know, I like to think about these sort of historical and cultural trends, and you know, it's a really interesting comparison you made to the Cold War, because that was a moment the Cold War began when everyone had an example of a world war in front of their eyes and the terrible damage that could cause and the terrible cost it could have. And when the Civil War began, people didn't have that. And the model that they had was, I found that when I was researching my book, a lot of people were talking about the revolution in 1861. The last Revolutionary War veterans were still alive in 1861. It was kind of amazing. And so people had very much this sense that their grandfathers had been heroes, and then, as Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, we've become a race of shopkeepers. And so there was this feeling of wanting to reconnect with that military glory and perhaps not fully a sense of the cost.
But there was no sense, I mean, you had the Napoleonic Wars since then, Crimea, we fought a Mexican War, which was no walk in the park. There was that did not permeate?
Well, no, because Shiloh, the casualties at Shiloh in April of '62, just not even a year into the war, were greater than the sum total of the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War put together. So it was bigger than Waterloo, and we had many, many, many more Waterloos to come. So.
Well, indeed, most Americans had no sense of what a kind of all-out war would ever be. The scale of this shocked everyone when it was 6 months old. But if it was indeed unavoidable, and I guess we have to assume it was since it did happen, it's unavoidable because something fundamental was at stake to people. There were two fundamentally different visions of an American future at work here. It had been at work for decades and decades. We can boil it down to these labels of free labor and slave labor, free soil and a slave society. We can boil it down to a slave economy and industrial economy if we wish. But people did have fundamental issues and interests at stake. This kind of thing only happens when something fundamental is at stake. I think you left out the Missouri border ruffian. I was just out in Kansas and Missouri last week lecturing, and
it's real.
That's a place where it was really a civil war, and the audience started arguing.
It was like Benghazi out there in 1961.
I was just there to generalize about the Civil War memory, and the Missourians and the Kansans kind of still have a problem with that. But I think we have to realize that this is one of the great old questions, isn't it, about the Civil War? When was it avoidable? If so, when was it unavoidable, and why? It's an unavoidable question because we would like to think
that we would be smart.
That compromisers might have somehow.
And that's what we're supposed to do so well.
It was supposed to happen.
And every historian has his or her favorite probably moment. My own is probably the Dred Scott case. You didn't ask for that, but...
of what tipped it over?
Well, after Dred Scott, in 1857, the Supreme Court decision, it really ruins moderation. After that, the Republican Party persuasion, locked on to this idea of stopping the expansion of slavery, is now absolutely counter to the law of the land. That's what I mean by fundamentals. And at the same time, the South and its long-term, multi-generational interest in sustaining slavery has just been sustained by the Supreme Court. And so, we have to look for those moments in time when this possibility of compromise just vanishes. And of course, there's still, there were dozens and dozens of compromise measures during that secession winter, some of which were quite interesting. But
I think in a funny kind of way, you also have to look at not just the things that divided the North and the South, but in a funny way, the things that they had that were similar were factors that helped to push them towards civil war. For instance, I talked about the Revolution, but also, it's been interesting, all of us writing for the Disunion series have seen, and those of you who have been reading the comments section of the pieces, that everybody wants to talk about the Civil War in terms of today. And they want to talk about, not just Lee and Grant, but Palin and Obama. They're very quick to draw those analogies. And some of them are very interesting, and some of them are a little bit scary, frankly. I'm sure nobody here has written scary comments. But anyway, it's interesting that people do that, because I actually do think that we live in a culture, our democratic culture, encourages us to, we're always hearing that we should fight for what we believe in. That's a positive American value. Stand up and fight. And we use the language of war in our politics all the time, and sometimes in very strident, as we've seen in our own time, strident ways. So I think in a funny kind of way, Americans may have been prepped, especially in the context of 19th century politics, which could literally be blood in the streets even before war broke out.
I had an experience working on another film about another war, the Second World War, well after the Civil War. And when soldiers in the Civil War were in combat, they said they'd seen the elephant. That was the term that suggested the exotic, something that other human experience didn't know. And it's true that when your violent death is possible at any moment, your existence is vivified to a level. But I found in the same thing, of course, in the Second World War happens, that within a few years after a war, it gets encrusted with the barnacles of sentimentality and nostalgia and mythology, and it permits human beings to forget that calculus that you were speaking about, the romanticism of the Revolutionary era, which Lincoln is invoking on the eve of the war in the last sentence of the first inaugural, when he's, from every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched as surely they will be by the better angels of our natures. Please, we must not be enemies, we must be friends.
You've looked at that speech once or twice, haven't you?
I like that speech a lot.
It's on the back of your hand.
Yeah.
It's a tattoo.
Yeah, that's right. That's a tattoo.
Well, and they all fought for liberty, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the language in 1861, well, actually throughout, and then in the wake of the war, everybody fought for liberty, right?
Right.
I mean,
They were all talking about George Washington, all
Yeah.
talking about the 4th of July.
everybody claiming liberty. And the Confederacy itself, even well into the war, its argument for itself to the world is that it's
The second American.
the true vessel of the American Revolution. It was their liberty over their
And you still get the
domestic
arguments
institution.
today.
Sure.
You still get the
Sure.
arguments today that are an attempt to sort of deflect the slavery question into something more palatable, but it has to do with individual freedoms and a way of life that's lost. And
But one of the things that makes the compromise part so particularly tempting to keep looking at is the fact that it wasn't just two sides, that in all of the slaveholding states, in each of them there was substantial support for the Union, and as we know in 4 of them, they stayed with the Union, somewhat, some more edgily than others, but
Kentucky only joined the Confederacy after the war,
that's right.
Maryland,
as
too.
they say.
So when as we go into the disunion thing, we know that, for example, in Georgia, they probably stole the votes. To the secessionists stole the votes. In Texas, when they had it, there was probably a lot of violence that kept Unionists home. So that it was a touch and go kind of thing in each of the individual states, which makes it all the more tempting to keep returning to this idea that something could have been worked out, that there was enough.
and what's been left out of the equation, as always, is left out of the equation and always has to be added in, and unfortunately too often as an afterthought, is that 45% of the population of the South are African Americans. And when we speak about this divide between two things, we're also forgetting that there is a human and moral urgency to the notion of freeing these people from bondage, or being freed from your own bondage, because we take still in retrospect a kind of paternalistic look at it and presume that African Americans are passive bystanders to this story and not the active, dedicated, self-sacrificing soldiers that they were.
And you could be, I mean, there were, as you just said, there were huge pockets of unionism. Upstate Georgia, northern Alabama.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
10,000 members of the Unionists fought for the Union Army from the hill country of North Carolina. The Confederacy was a rich man's cause in those places.
And it really was, in many of these places, secession was a kind of a coup d'etat. It was a minority, a small group of elite men who were sort of taking over the apparatus of the state. But the funny thing is that it sort of came back to bite them later in the war, because the Confederacy was undermined really throughout the war by the internal dissent. And it's another thing where, when David talked about Kentucky and my state of Maryland becoming Confederate after the war, a lot of people, I think, became pro-Confederate decades after the war in these places, especially when they start handing out the state pensions to veterans. Granddaddy didn't talk about how he'd actually skedaddled and gone back to the farm
And that had a lot to do with race relations too.
and a lot to do with race relations as well.
But you could be very pro-slavery, but also very pro-union, which we easily forget. Once the war comes,
It's all just
everybody in a
red state, blue state.
Right.
Confederate state, they're all Confederate.
And race did change the equation. Emancipation changed the equation and changed people's allegiances hugely.
But when you talked about a coup d'etat, it sort of amazes me that in all the arguments over the years of whether it should be called the Civil War or the war between the states or the war of northern aggression, no one ever says, oh, this is the Slaveholders Rebellion.
I thought it was the late unpleasantness.
Late unpleasantness.
No, the official
Frederick
name
Douglass called it the Slaveholders Rebellion even before Fort Sumter.
Indeed.
And he's still calling it that.
And
in
the official
1865.
name of it is the War of the Rebellion. Our country, the winning side, that is to say the United States of America, is official designation as the War of the Rebellion.
And that's on all the Union monuments.
And that's
and
all-
so forth.
Why isn't it on your documentary that way? The War of the Rebellion.
It's popularly
Mark,
known as the
but I
Civil
mean, I
War.
think that's amazing, though, that the
But I was.
you wanted Southern viewership.
No. You lose a Southern viewership
I
with
know,
that.
all right.
I was on Missionary
a
Ridge
lost show.
after the series came out, and I was confronted by an elderly white Southerner and his wife, and the guy was pushing me back to the edge of Missionary Ridge, complaining that I had called it the Civil War, and it was the war between the states or the War of Northern Aggression, all the funny stuff that people say, or as General Johnston said, it was the war against the states, which is an interesting variation on what was lost in that cause. But I finally said Robert E. Lee called it the Civil War, and then he backed off because I thought, I'm going to live.
Trump card.
I'm going to live another day. Robert E. Lee called it the Civil War.
how far do you think you can carry it? Can you go down there and say, Robert E. Lee validated my parking?
Well, my biggest problem is that I gave an interview once on public television that was broadcast nationally, in which I'd said that the Civil War was so interesting, and we both love Robert Penn Warren, and I want to read at some point a very appropriate quote about it.
We brought a book.
But he, never mind, it's just too complicated about it. I said that Robert E. Lee is our favorite general that emerges in the popular culture of the Civil War, the unexamined, or at least for most of our history, Robert E. Lee was the general that people remembered. But he's responsible for more loyal American deaths than Hitler or Tojo.
That's right.
And that caused the revocation of my membership in the Sons of the Confederacy.
Well,
I didn't know I was already a member, but I was expelled.
But that's one of the most puzzling aspects of this story to foreign.
Yeah.
Our friends who come from abroad wonder, how is it that the leader,
Of the
the
opposition.
general of this rebellion against your government, treason by any definition, has monuments all over your landscape? And then, of course, you say, well, there's these 6 books you ought to read. And this film
Well,
goes.
And it's not only
because it's complicated and it's all about race.
Yeah,
and
it's not just
but that
monuments
doesn't answer it.
on the landscape either. I have written about a place called Fort Monroe in Virginia that we were talking about, which you just find historical irony upon irony upon irony with the Civil War. It's amazing, just a layer cake of ironies. And Fort Monroe is the place where the first slaves were landed in 1619. It's the place where the first contraband slaves were freed in the war in 1861. It's also the place where Jefferson Davis was imprisoned awaiting treason trial, which never happened, at the end of the war. And what do they have there today as a monument? They have a gigantic wrought iron archway that says Jefferson Davis Memorial Park. And I'm there and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this is a U.S. Army base.
That's right.
They have a monument to a guy whose troops, made Osama bin Laden look like the T-ball league, And it's a very, very strange thing. They have forts, U.S. Army forts named after
10 of them.
Confederate
10
generals.
are named after Confederate generals, which,
Hood Hill.
I mean, why, in 150 years, we haven't found some other noteworthy military figure to name the base after? I don't quite know. Let me ask you a question, Ken, about your show is being aired again on PBS. It's been 20 years since you first aired it. What have you come to reconsider, if anything, not about the show itself, but is there some larger or different perspective on the Civil War now that after you've lived with it and so intimately in the 20 years since?
Not really. The reason why I did it was because of this just overwhelming sense that this was the central moment in our existence, the traumatic event in the childhood of the nation, whatever you want to say. And I was drawn to it because it was the subject. It seemed to be a determining factor in every one of the subjects. Very diverse films that I'd done before the Civil War. 6 films couldn't have been different, but the Civil War was there, sort of influencing. And it's the last 20 and a half years have only confirmed that more, the centrality of it, that everything led up to it, everything since has been in some ways a consequence of it. And you know, there obviously, as you look at it, you say, oh, I wish you would do this or that, and you remember all of the arguments, what was left on the cutting room floor. So, you know, setting aside, as you did, the actual production itself, I'm just stunned at how powerful it is. It was interesting that after our series came out, Northerners began to reclaim the history. This has been a province of Southerners, and it's where you could get that. And they had their, you know, beautiful statues that went unnoticed in their, you know, leafy town squares, and suddenly they were noticing it and wondering what they had done and what their ancestors had done. And so I think, in a sense, the only thing that's changed is, I think, our own reinvestment with it, and in a different kind of way than we had. I remember a young boy of 8 at the time of the centennial, and being disappointed even at that time by what seemed to be a sort of a focus on regiments and arrows on the map and armaments, and missing, and maybe you'll correct me, missing a lot of the sort of thing that I was drawn to in the Civil War, even as a young boy. And my brother and I, we'd end up working on the film together, would play Civil War soldiers, you know, all the time. And I was disappointed and let down by the centennial. But it was interesting, beginning with Jim McPherson's book and our series and the movie Glory, that we were engaging in a different, deeper thing that tried to broaden the perspective of the story and the perspectives of the story. And I think that's been the case. We've continued. I mean, it's why we're here.
Joe DiMaggio used to say you'd go out and play hard every day on the off chance that there was somebody in the crowd who hadn't seen him play before. On the off chance that there's somebody here who hasn't seen Ken Burns' series, we have a clip. So,
Sorry.
it's all right.
Between 1861 and 1865, Americans made war on each other and killed each other in great numbers, if only to become the kind of country that could no longer conceive how that was possible. What began as a bitter dispute over Union and states' rights ended as a struggle over the meaning of freedom in America. At Gettysburg in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said perhaps more than he knew. The war was about a new birth of freedom.
Wait, there's more.
I love that line about what started as the bitter struggle about union and state rights turned into the new birth of freedom. Pithy and eminently tweetable. But it really does, in a way, it's very hard for us to appreciate what exactly that states' rights and that union argument was about. So, because it was obviously an unsettled question, a much younger nation, and obviously still very much in formation. This really was a disturbing and turbulent question for them.
Well, the states' rights question isn't settled yet. I mean, just read today's paper, or you know. But we can come back to that if you want. Can I comment just briefly on that clip, because I think it illustrated why that film series had such power. You did accomplish, I thought, in a withering way, the sense of loss in that war. And that photo, by the way, is one of the starkest we have of the dead. But the last line, of course, says that it was also redeemable, that it was redeemed. And that seems to me still the open question.
Yeah.
I mean, how was it redeemed? When was it redeemed? For whom was it redeemed? How long did it take? Are we there yet? Who got redeemed and who didn't? I mean, and that's, of course, what we all want from tragedy. That's Robert Penn Warren's vision of tragedy, right? It takes you to man's bleak confrontation with fate, but something survives. Something did survive.
At the end of
but
the
we're
film,
still debating.
At the end of the
what
film,
was
Barbara
redeemed.
Field says exactly this dynamic when this is a Columbia University historian who's in the film a great deal, and she says that the Civil War can still be lost. And I think
Right.
that the enduring appeal of it is that the questions of it go to the heart of who we are, and they are unresolved. Unresolved about race, unresolved about victory, unresolved about states' rights, unresolved about so many of the aspects of it. And the thing is, now I sort of feel obligated to read Red, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Jamie, is that okay?
Please.
We didn't prepare this
We
until
didn't. We
2
were just.
minutes
I
before.
saw this book, which we just loved. It's a small essay called "The Legacy of the Civil War" by Robert Penn Warren, who had been an extraordinary advisor to us on several films, on Huey Long, and then on this one, and had become a friend. But we were going through this, and there's.
Be careful with the pages, it's really old.
It is really, really old, and well worn by David, who permitted me. And this for me is this, I think, it's hard to find anything written about the Civil War, I think, better than this. And if you'll just permit me these couple of sentences. He said, "A civil war is, we may say, the prototype of all war. For in the persons of fellow citizens who happen to be the enemy, we meet again with the old ambivalence of love and hate, and with all the old guilts, the blood brothers of our childhood. In a civil war, especially in one such as this, when the nation share deep and significant convictions and is not a mere handbasket of factions huddled arbitrarily together by historical happen-so, all the self-divisions of conflicts within individuals become a series of mirrors in which the plight of the country is reflected, and the self-divisions of the country a great mirror in which the individual may see imaged his own deep conflicts, not only the conflicts of political loyalties, but those more profoundly personal." And it's why it's alive. And we can rest all the arguments and the explanations and the tidbits of history on all of that. It isn't just about blue and gray.
Yeah, well, Warren, I mean, I don't know if you've read Robert Penn Warren lately. You should before you go to bed tonight. But
Skip the NCAA basketball.
yeah, forget that.
Yeah. Just the opening of All the King's Men was coming at you, coming at you, coming at you.
But Warren had, as a Southerner, who ends up living the last 40 years of his life in the North, had this deep and abiding sense of authentic tragedy about that event. And it's his prodding in this little book and many other places, and there are others like him. It's his attempt to prod us to not always want to find in this Civil War a positive ending,
Right.
a sentimental story,
Exactly.
a kind of pleasure in the past. We should find pleasure in the past. But he's saying if we don't see the tragedy, the authentic tragedy in this, then we will never understand it.
Right.
And we will never understand if anything is actually redeemed until we understand what the tragedy
Why
was.
is it so obscured? I'm sorry, Adam, but why is it so obscured? I mean, if you go to Europe, they understand that the First World War was a complete tragedy. If you go to Germany, they understand what happened to them in the Second World War. How is it that we, whatever the Duke brothers painted their car, put a flag on it, and
Yeah, but we see that in those dialectical preoccupation that we have today. But it's Walt Kelly. We've met the enemy, and he is us. And I think that what Robert Penn Warren understood was how much this thing that we call America or the United States was itself not the mere handbasket of factions huddled arbitrarily together by a historical happen-so, but also within ourselves complicated psychologies of divisions. You can even hear it in Lincoln's first inaugural when he's pleading and arguments against secession, suggesting that at the end of secession is not just states seceding from countries, but parts of states seceding from other parts of states. And you could go logically, family members from families, divorce, we call it, and inside oneself. And so I think it's always embedded with us is the disturbance of the Civil War, which has no resolution.
And your
But
point,
I think that,
Go ahead, Ed.
I think that, getting back to this issue of tragedy, it's something that's, I think, harder for us as Americans, as you suggested, to get to than some other people. And, this question of was the Civil War worth it? It's like we want to turn history into an Excel spreadsheet all the time, and tally everything up. And we see it in our politics today. Well, at what point is this intervention in Libya going to be worth it or not worth it? And especially with war, it's just an unleashing of so many unpredictable energies. There's something that happens simply when people start firing guns at each other that changes everything. And I think in retrospect, that can be hard to fully appreciate.
And your question about certain European countries or elsewhere in the world, why do they seem to have maybe a deeper sense of tragedy than we do? At the risk of generalization here with this very sophisticated audience, I do think Americans tend not to have an authentic sense of tragedy about their past. We are raised in this, it doesn't matter what we academics write, doesn't matter how many decades go by of interpreting this war rooted in slavery, we have a culture that still insists that our history be triumphal, progressive, always redemptive.
And exceptional.
Yeah.
And exceptional, and always somehow solving our problems. Ask the Russians if history is always progressive and triumphal. I mean, ask the Germans. I mean, it's not even the question they want to be asked. You know, it's not always triumphal, they'll say. Let us tell you the ways, you know.
But the history here, you know, we want that because it's what we have, it's what we share. And when people talk about the obsession with the Civil War, you know, in this country what we have that brings us all together is not a racial identity, an ethnic identity, a language that we can all look back to, a culture. And so we have these stories. For a lot of Americans, it's kind of amazing to me that 100 million Americans, so 1 in 3 Americans, has a Civil War soldier somewhere in the family tree.
You're kidding.
And no, seriously.
And
of course, many more people have ancestors who may have been in slavery, who were
1 in
freed.
3.
1 in 3 Americans.
Even with the new immigration.
Yes.
Even with the new immigration. And so, you know, my ancestors were somewhere in a Lithuanian shtetl at the time of the Civil War. They probably didn't know, you know, they probably weren't Union or Confederate at all. I'm sure they had their other problems, but...
Potential border ruffians.
Potential border ruffians, yeah, that sort of Belarus border there. But, you know, but people come to America, and Tony Horwitz writes beautifully about this in Confederates in the Attic. He talks about his grandfather coming, I think also from an Eastern European Jewish shtetl in the 1880s, and the first thing that he bought was a book about the Civil War, because it's what we have that we all share as Americans.
And I think your film series tapped that, as you well know, the letters you received, the family. And I just spent some time writing not only about Penn Warren, but Bruce Catton, the great popular historian of the Civil War. And just a quick anecdote about it, he has enormous papers, and they are full of thousands of fan letters. And when you start calculating ages, Bruce Catton's writing in the 1950s and 60s, but he gets fan letters from people who want to tell him that on page 92 of Stillness at Appomattox, that's my grandfather you're quoting from a diary. And you suddenly realize he's writing about their grandparents, and in some cases even their fathers.
Their fathers.
Right.
In the 1950s, he's tapping into this massive reservoir of family experience.
I had a piece on General Benjamin Butler in the Times yesterday.
Right.
I have heard from literally 6 descendants of Benjamin Butler in the last 24 hours.
My God. And they're saying they're not ugly, right?
Well, you know,
it was
ugly. It was very lucky because Benjamin Butler married a beautiful former actress, and then their daughter married a very handsome man at Albert Ames, and so the genetics straightened itself out.
That was a great article.
Doesn't always work
and
that
it's
way.
so important. We loved Benjamin Butler because he's known, he comes down as Beast Butler for having Southern women treated as ladies of the night because they were pouring their chamber pots on the Union soldiers that are occupying New Orleans. And so he became one of those things like Sherman's troops raping white women in the March to the Sea never happened. But Butler is really the person who began this slow motion towards emancipation in a really practical way by treating the runaway slaves as contraband of war. Right. And he just thumbs his nose at the South. Well, wait a second. You say you're in another country? So we will take these people. The Fugitive Slave Act does not suggest that we have to return them to another country. And I mean, he's really out there on the front lines of the change.
And they called him, you know, the other name besides Beast Butler, they called him Spoons Butler.
Right,
because
Spoons.
the story was that he had plundered spoons, silver spoons, and so when he ran for president in 1884, hecklers used to stand in the back of the room and yell, "Spoons, spoons!" But I literally I went to mention I got invited to their family reunion, of the Butler family.
Oh my God.
You don't know what's in store for you.
I'm sure. I'll see if I'm busy that week.
Thousands of reunion invitations.
But Butler is one of the things that's amazing in writing about the disunion period is the sort of growing realization of a lot of people in the North that, hey, we won this election.
Yeah.
That after...
And he was a Democrat.
Right.
He wasn't even a Republican.
But that after all these years of compromising and making nice to the South and saying, yes, honey, okay, you can keep the slaves, please don't leave us, that they finally won an election that they won, and part of the reaction to the South was their anger, saying, wait a minute, you play fair and square. You lost the election, now you're going to run away and secede?
I think you just put your finger on one of the hardest things for, I know, students to sometimes grasp, and maybe the general populace, and that is, why were Northerners so eager to fight this war at first? I mean, it's easier to understand the South. It's for home. They're invaded, they say, et cetera, et cetera. But why were Northerners so eager? Well, it's hard to convey sometimes just how important this idea of union, social order, holding the nation together, and that has a lot to do with the economy, of course. If you're in Chicago, you care about whether those southern states are tied to the Midwest. If you're in New York, you care about the border states. I mean, this was, to many Northerners, and again, they don't understand all-out war yet, this was the breakup of their very social fabric, and those secessionists were the cause. So by God, go get them.
There was a number of editorials where people, Midwestern states, were ready to make war just because of the idea that Louisiana would be taking away the lower Mississippi.
Right.
But I think David's right. It is this intangible thing too. This, when Catton, I think, wrote something about when a young man's fatherland was what he could see from his bedroom window, he was willing to suddenly join up. I mean, think of yourself in the northern part of the southern peninsula of Michigan, and going off to war in the Civil War, in the transportation of the day. This is a huge. This is a person who disappears perhaps forever, might leave a limb or a good friend or himself in territories they had never ever heard about, with strange names that didn't sound like the strange names of their places, and they went. And I find the Union cause. We always have sort of sentimentalized and romanticized the Southern sense, as you say, because they're invaded, but also that the chivalry and the death of that Sir Walter Scott. But I mean, what will propel a Northern Michigan boy to go and fight for an idea? Well, this isn't home invasion. This is an idea. I
think we can appreciate that maybe in a different way now than we could 10 or 20 years ago. It's interesting how every generation sort of rewrites, or maybe instead of saying rewrites, but comes to its own understanding of the Civil War. For the civil rights generation, it was about civil rights. For the sort of 1980s people, written interestingly about how Glory was a sort of a post-Vietnam War film looking for the good war. Well, I think now, we have a sort of a post-9/11 Civil War in some ways. And for me, I think without 9/11, I wouldn't have appreciated that Fort Sumter moment, and just how in an instant, everything can change. And the present changes, the future changes, in some ways the understanding of the past changes.
And it changed Virginians from anti-secession to secession.
That's right. It changes everyone. And it's funny because when 9/11 happened, I'm sure we each have our own individual experiences of 9/11, but it changed people in very unpredictable ways that didn't necessarily have to do only with what their politics were before that moment. And there was something in the experience of that itself. It was also, it was sort of America's first 9/11 or Pearl Harbor moment, in the sense that it was experienced by almost everyone simultaneously. And that was huge. In 1775, the so-called shot heard around the world took weeks and weeks to get around even the country, let alone.
The telegraph made it instant.
Yeah, I mean, Walt Whitman, steps out of the theater on the night after Sumter is bombarded, and newsboys are running through the streets of Lower Manhattan at midnight, and men are gathered around under each street lamp. There are men holding their newspapers and poring over the news, and you read that and you can't help but think of our own times.
And there'd been this buildup for 5 months since the election.
Yeah.
and even longer, this constant daily search for news, what's happening next, and suddenly.
One thing that occurs to me that's often left out of the conversation about the lead up, because we put it in purely political or economic or even social terms, is a kind of religious and metaphysical sense. That remember that as we are growing politically towards disunion, we are also growing together in our sense of who we are as a country. And you just alluded to that we see ourselves as this bastion, this new world, this new Eden, unspoiled by all that Europe has done to itself over the ages, and that we have this opportunity, and transcendentalism reflects that. It's possible to find God not in cathedrals built by man, but out in nature, not with some dogmatic devotion that's prescribed in books, but something one experiences on your own in this purely democratic spirit. And so what you have are the divergence of these psychological, Red Warren would say, spiritual, religious sort of movements that are gluing the country together in one sense of a whole thing, an is rather than an are, and the political stuff that is suggesting the disunion, which is why the first sentence that we had, that in order to become one, we tore ourselves in two.
And you know, when you talk about that culture, the sort of the cultural roots, and you know, we always hear that the South was the land of Sir Walter Scott and the North was the land of sort of hard-fisted, money-grubbing businessmen. Well, the fact is this was the high romantic era for North and South. And you know, in both parts of the country, every family had its volume of Tennyson, and they're reading about King Arthur and his knights, and they're memorizing the stuff. I mean, it was almost like rock music in the 60s, and Byron. You know, people are grooving in a deep way to this music, this romantic music. And you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe read and reread Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe 9 times in the course of one summer until she'd memorized almost the whole thing. You can't say that the South had that as their exclusive property.
But that's what's happened, that in the decades after the Civil War, the South appropriated. It's so funny because the winners usually write the histories, but in this case, the histories were written for more than a century by the losers.
I mean, Adam, exactly right. Let's look at the second clip from Ken's series that we have, because it segues well.
Any understanding of this nation has to be based, and I mean really based, on an understanding of the Civil War. I believe that firmly. It defined us. The Revolution did what it did. Our involvement in European wars, beginning with the First World War, did what it did. But the Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things. And it is very necessary, if you're going to understand the American character in the 20th century, to learn about this enormous catastrophe of the mid-19th century. It was the crossroads of our being, and it was a hell of a crossroads.
None of this is rehearsed, by the way. This is just throwing out a question.
So at the risk of being a little heretical here, if in 1985 or 1989 you say that to understand 20th century Americans you need to understand this event, but I'm wondering if early 21st century Americans are as interpretable that way, that when we talk about our 7th Avenue fashionistas and our baristas in Seattle and our former...
You're making us responsible for them?
Former... Yeah, I mean, okay. but basically that there's it seems the wheel has moved, and that that in many ways we are a nation now that is more influenced and the product of the civil rights movement than the Civil War.
Well, yeah, but only in the way that we know our parents maybe better than our grandparents, or didn't know our great-grandparents. Can I take up crossroads of our being as a way? I mean, that incredible phrase by Shelby Foote, which, you know, if you want to understand federalism, our forever struggle to understand the relationship of the federal government and states, which we're now having this incredible roiling debate over again, more than a debate, Speaking of coup d'etats, I mean,
and Second Amendment remedies.
And Second Amendment remedies, and 10th Amendment people, and so on. This is where you have to go back to understand it. If you want to understand big government, I mean, big government was invented by something called the Lincoln administration, the first Republican Party. They're the party of Lincoln still, but they're not the party of big government. They forget that sometimes. If you really want to understand why we even had a civil rights movement, you got to understand why the first Reconstruction failed or wasn't complete. I mean, crossroads of our being is a great phrase. I think what he really means, I don't know what he really means, but what I would mean is the Civil War, as Lincoln says in the Gettysburg Address, is really the destruction of the First Republic.
Yes.
It's dead, folks, is what he's saying.
Yep.
It's being reborn.
It's the beginning of our second act.
It's the Second Republic being born. It's redefined in a new Constitution. I don't think most Americans right now, they're very interested in this event. Courses are packed. People read about it, we hope. But I don't think most Americans really grasp that war destroyed the first American Republic, necessitated the invention of a second one, which also failed by and large and had to be reinvented yet again in the Civil Rights Movement. It's that kind of continuity. It's the reason we do history. And there's no question, we're more the society formed out of the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement than we necessarily are the Civil War. But all of the issues are essentially the same issue.
I agree.
Adam was talking a moment ago about a 9/11 experience. The Civil War, of course, did have its 9/11 moment in the John Brown raid. And I think
I was thinking about Fort Sumter,
but I mean, I think if not to overdraw too many parallels, but I think one of the things that we often forget about is the degree to which that really did freak out the South.
Oh, yeah.
I remember reading in one anecdote that down in Louisiana, a man on the street somebody thought he was a horse thief, and he yelled, "Stop that thief." And by the time the man had run a block, people down the block were saying, "Stop the abolitionist, stop the abolitionist." So that there was this now a whole pervasive fear that drove events.
It was an all-pervasive fear. That's a wonderful word, pervasive, because fear just pervaded every part of Southern society and Southern life. There was, of course, the fear that was inflicted on black Southerners, which fear was ultimately the only enforcement of slavery. Fear and violence were ultimately the only ways to enforce the slave system. But then that sort of was cosmically, karmically repaid on the white Southerners themselves by the fear that they lived in every day of that moment of retribution that was going to come, and that they all on some level felt was going to come. But then in turn that was made a sort of an even worse torment for them, because they had to contort themselves. They had to learn, every Southerner had to learn to say at the same time, our slaves are happy, contented, they love us. And then they had to say in the next breath, and if we let them hear a whisper of this abolitionist dogma, they'll rise up and kill us in our beds. And imagine living with that day in and day out.
And how many white Union soldiers have been raised on that idea that all the slaves are content, but when they get into Fort Monroe, in fact, they get into the South and they see, they write back and say, these are not content people. They all want to,
and as Ken was saying, for a kid from northern Michigan going down to Georgia was, much farther away than, I think, in some ways than a young Marine going to Afghanistan.
I agree.
Today. And the same thing, we think about slaves. Well, for most people, they were just sort of abstractions mentioned on election day speeches, and then they get down to the South and they'd never talked to a slave before.
I interviewed a woman named Daisy Turner, who was 103 years old when I interviewed her in, I think, 1988 or 88 or 87. And her father had escaped from slavery in Virginia, had joined the New Jersey Black Cavalry Regiment, and gone back to his plantation and killed his former overseer. And then he moved his family to Vermont, which was the only state in the Union that had entered the Union with slavery already proscribed.
That was a smart move, going to Vermont.
And she recited for us this amazing poem, but it was Alex Turner to me is that the story that we stopped telling these sorts of stories, the violence and the brutality of the system. I mean, we began, the first chapter of our series has not white people in it. It's called All Night Forever. It's about what it is like to be a slave. Let us not, after the introduction, let us not forget what this is all about, because we've done nothing but abstract it for a century and a half.
Yeah, I mean, the Congress read the Constitution at the start of this year's session and left out the business about 3/5.
Yeah, well, this always happens. And you know, you've got a report, Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns. We now add, when we say the Jim Crow era, we just say Jim Crow. You know, and you read her book and you understand what it meant. I mean, it's like slavery seems sort of comforting and paternalistic.
Or read Richard Wright.
But this goes to the point again of where if your country's history must always be a narrative of redemptive progress, where do you fit the second largest system of human slavery in the world? Where do you fit an all-out civil war? I mean, how do you fit these? You have to find a way to fit them in. You have to make them part of a progressive narrative.
You welcome Robert E. Lee back in and you make him your favorite general and you do all of these sort of tricks to make sure
and
that
Thomas Nelson Page becomes the best-selling author of 1890 with Happy Darky stories. The voice in the ear of the American reunion becomes the faithful slave in popular literature by the turn of the 20th century, which is hard for us to grasp today. I mean, you wonder, well, who's reading this stuff? Well, hundreds of thousands of people were reading it. It was a major form of entertainment to forget what the Civil War was about.
Well, was there no competing narrative? Was there no narrative?
Yes.
And there's other things going on, but you have the collapse of Reconstruction, and then everybody pretends that.
And the publishing industry
for the reason for it that it happened.
And the publishing industry followed the well.
Right.
Yeah. Doesn't always do that.
Can I tell a personal story? My grandmother was in high school in the aughts of this past century, and she had invited her favorite high school teacher back for dinner, a woman, and my grandmother told the story many times, and her mother and her had my great-grandmother had the closest relationship they'd ever had. And they had been eating dinner, and grandmother would always stop and say, and my mother never said a cross word to me in her entire life. At this point, she starts to tear up, remembering that this was going to be the only cross word she heard. So the mother is clearing the dishes and in the pantry, and the history teacher turns to my grandmother and says, well, Lucille, we're studying the Civil War. Who do you want to win? This is in Baltimore, Maryland. And my grandmother said, why, the North, of course. And her mother stamps her foot and says, Lucille, you do not mean that. And my grandmother, at this point, tears just cascaded down her face. And the history teacher said, well, we're pleased that the Union survived, but our sympathies will always be with the South. This is 1909, 1910, somewhere around there.
You know, it's interesting. It reminds me of a story that I've heard from somebody who's here tonight who's written some of the most marvelous pieces for the Disunion series, Ted Widmer from Brown University, who's not on the panel, but he did that whole series of Lincoln's approach to Washington that was amazing.